See, but what I want to do is last week I left off in covenant, and I talked to you about the way of, or the valley of death, and what was that? What you remember what that was? When they had covenant, how would they establish a covenant? God did this with Abraham. Go ahead, Marvin. So they would take animals and they would actually cut them in two, split them in two, and put them on each side of a walkway. And then the covenant partners would walk through that. And you could see one of the covenant partners right here walking through it and getting blood on their garments. And they would walk through arm in arm after they had a blood sharing or blood brother ceremony. And they would be saying, may it happen to me or happen to us what happened to these animals if either one of us breaks covenant. So the idea is that when God did that with Abram, Abram went ahead and really laid the animals out there, but then God put them in a deep sleep, and God went through that as if to say, may it happen to me what happened to these animals if in fact Abram or I break this covenant. And of course, Abram didn't have anything to do with it. So God walked the valley of death, and then ultimately that's a foreshadowing of Jesus walking the valley of death. Now, one of the things I talked about is the exchange concept in covenant. And covenant is the idea that all that I am and all that I have, I exchange for all that you are and all that you have. So when I was talking last week, I talked about the whole idea of separate checking accounts, etc. Not some people have separate checking accounts, like John said, and I, by the way, have that kind of checking account too. Gigi puts money in my account and tells me how much I've got. But the idea here is, I'm not talking about that. Well, in separate vacations, the same way. People go on, Gigi goes on vacations, for example, with her sisters. I mean, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about are people who essentially live separate lives. Yes.
A group of us that her son, they had a Christian marriage, Christian couple, about to divorce after a year because the wife insists that the husband sign a contract. I said, didn't they have a covenant? But anyway, she says he doesn't love her because he will not sign this contract. And it's instigated by her father. Now he can't even talk to his wife, only through her dad. Is this weird?
See, and people take a contractual view of what's intended to be a covenant. And I think the legal profession has kind of kidnapped the whole concept of covenant, because they list covenant as simply a contract. And if you look in Webster's, it will say covenant, a form of a contract. And really it's not, because contracts, what are you doing in a contract? You're evaluating performance. And if the other person doesn't measure up to your performance expectations, you have contingencies that allow you to get out of that contract. Well, people impose a contractual view on what's intended to be a covenant, and they miss the boat. And I do think God had better things in mind for us. God had a design of a relationship that was marked by giving as opposed to taking or receiving. But in giving, you both receive more. So that's the idea. That was the intention. We talked about that last week. We had a lot of conversation, and because we had all that conversation, we didn't get to points 2 and 3. So I'm going to finish this today. And so one of the things I want to look at is, because Saul had what we call growing fear. And I think here we go. There we go. Saul had growing fear. And one of the things you talk about is sometimes people's aggression or people's anger. And by the way, how many people heard the message this morning? I got a real kick out of that, because I had two takeaways. First of all, when he talked about everybody came beside that lady and they all put up Christmas lights in February, Gigi leaned over to me and said, well, why didn't they just help her take her Christmas lights? I mean, really, that was one takeaway. The other takeaway was even funnier. I'm sitting there and he's talking about, well, you know, there are three approaches to this when things happen that frustrate you. You can get angry, you can lash out, you complain. But he said, does that do you any good? And this lady sitting in front of me said, uh-huh. I'm just saying. I guess the core of the message I lost in laughing. But what I want to do is take a look at Saul's growing fear, because Bob George once wrote a book called Anger, Fear, and Disguise. And in a recent article in Very Well Mind, there's a psychologist, Amy Marshall, and she elaborated on the subject. Jack, can you read that?
The human experience of fear begins in the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes many of our emotions. When it is activated due to possible danger, it elicits the fear response. When we experience the fight response, our brain is trying to ward off danger by defeating it. If the danger is real and can be overcome with physical strength, this can be an effective tool. But when the perceived danger is not actually a threat, this can get us into trouble.
Now, do you know anybody like this who at least operates this way when they get under pressure, get under stress, their default mechanism is anger? Do you know anybody like that? Who, when they get pushed or get stressed, and Gigi's laughing because it happens to me sometimes. Yeah. You get stressed and all of a sudden you get angry. And what's that about? Well, sometimes it's about fear, and that's really the problem that Saul had. Saul was afraid of David, wasn't he? He was afraid, and we see that in 1 Samuel 18, verses 6 through 9, Jack.
When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, and with tambourines and lutes. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David.
What's going on here with Saul? What's happening here? He's insecure. Okay, what else? Paranoid. Jealous. Angry. All those things are emerging because all of a sudden David's getting more attention than he is. And he's upset about this. And sadly, Saul's jealous and angry and fearful response to David is very human, but it grows. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, Samuel had already told him that God would probably become more that David is the most likely.
Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, he was doing everything he could to preserve his time as king. And in fact, he knew that his time was coming to an end. But I thought about this is a very human issue. And I thought about this and I realized that I've experienced similar circumstances. And I have to tell you about this. I remember my first year as a coach, a high school basketball coach. I was a head coach. And this was shortly after I was saved. And we had a relatively young team. And I was young and immature as a Christian. And that season, we only won 6 games. All but 2 of them, we were close. And we almost won, but we didn't. And I had an assistant coach, his name was Harvey. And Harvey had been the JV coach and they did well underneath him. But I was a new guy and we did things differently. Now he played slow down basketball. I played fast break transition basketball. Big difference, big difference. Well, folks got to talking, as you know they might. And as they talked, Harvey wasn't really very nice about it. In fact, I think he enjoyed seeing our losses. Matter of fact, I don't think, I know he did. And it bugged me. Wouldn't that bug you? Would that bug you? It bugged the daylights out of me, but I kept it to myself. But Harvey thought he should be the head coach. There was no doubt in his mind about it. But instead, they'd given it to this young, cocky 26-year-old. That was me. And that gossip and tension lasted for a while. But the next year, the team learned my system. And I learned from my mistakes. And I also got a new assistant. His name was John Fraser. He was a very, very funny guy. And he cracked the kids up. And the team set a record that year for school wins. And they had a lot of fun doing it. Harvey didn't like that. And Harvey's anxiety grew, and he wanted me to lose, but I didn't. Why do you think he wanted me to lose so badly? Yeah, he wanted the job. He wanted to be promoted to the head coach, just like Saul wanted to keep his job. No, a little bit. Well, I'll tell you, I'm pretty sure that Harvey didn't plan to kill me, but he wouldn't have been upset if I wound up somehow getting in an accident and not being able to coach. And I'm sure that I didn't plan to kill Harvey, but I do understand Saul's emotions here, and they're very human and quite real. Can any of you relate to this? Yeah, I mean, it happens on a daily basis. And what I found is really there are two reasons for his emotions here. 1 Samuel 18, 10, 11, Jack.
The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice.
All right, so what we got here, and what I saw was, first, it says right up front, what? What about Saul? What did he have on him? He had an evil spirit. So why would God do that? Why would God give him an evil spirit?
Did he give it or did he allow it?
Well, what's interesting about it is I believe God didn't really give him an evil spirit. He allowed it to happen, and Saul had already opened himself up to this through his disobedience. And he, a couple of times, major times, he disobeyed God. And he made himself available for this evil spirit. And it started when God removed his spirit from Saul in chapter 16. And also some translations, and I think this is probably more accurate, translated distressing spirit instead of evil spirit, which may be more accurate. Think about him being distressed about all of this. He's about to lose his kingdom. Glenn.
I think part of the issue he was no longer, he wanted justification for his position. He wanted to have the comfort, I guess, that affords, and in the fear of losing that, and to be relevant. I think a lot of people deal with that, those being justified and being relevant. I think when you take those things away, it leaves you in sort of a lost position.
Well, almost to the point where sometimes that fear leads to our irrational behavior. And that's certainly what it did in Paul. But does that ever happen? God removes his spirit of grace? Mike?
Sort of an illustration of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, self-control. I think all of us have these emotions. What do you choose to do with it? So do you nurture that, or do you put that in context and say, well, I may be envious of this person, but I'm going to celebrate. I'm going to choose to celebrate your success and see that as positive. And
Well,
I mean, it's a choice.
Yeah.
You can, when you start to get angry, you can say, what am I afraid of? Okay, let me deal with this at the heart and have self-control. And I don't think it all comes natural. God, it's an illustration. Without me, and without self-control, without faith in me, things are not going to go well for you.
Well, then let me ask you this. Does God ever take his spirit of grace away from us? Why does that happen? Why did it happen to Saul? He went?
He rejects God.
Gwen?
I think it's to drive him back to him. The absence of being in his presence will, and realizing that will bring us back, hopefully.
It's a learning.
Alvin.
The Bible actually says it was because of his disobedience.
Yeah.
In fact, Samuel said to him, the reason why it had happened was his disobedience.
Well, and it's not just his disobedience, but that was the cause of it. He disobeyed God and he allowed these negative emotions to grow in him, and he never repented. Saul was not repentant at all, and sometimes we do the same thing.
Excuse after excuse after excuse. It was everybody else's fault, but it wasn't his.
As a matter of fact, when Samuel approached Saul, what was he doing? When he approached him about his disobedience, you remember what he was doing? He was creating a monument to himself.
Yeah.
Okay, and he wasn't the least bit repentant nor reticent about what he'd done. So the first reason is that God had removed his spirit of grace on him, had taken away the Holy Spirit from him, and really it was a result of his disobedience. But second, I think in a positive sense, God was also blessing David. 1 Samuel 18:12-16, Jack.
Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led his troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel.
Hold on a second, Jack. When Saul saw how successful he was what? Afraid of him. Why? Well, his success is growing and growing and growing, and he knows he's going to lose the kingdom. Go ahead, Jack.
But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns.
So that makes matters even worse. Not only is he successful, everybody loves the poor guy. So can you see this happening to Saul?
Why it would say he was prophesying in his house.
While Saul was prophesying. Well, why did that happen? Why do you think that happened? Because Saul went down there to take care of David, and there were other people who were prophesying as well. Why do you think that happened? Why do you think God allowed him to prophesy?
ESV has a different term for it. In verse 10, verse 10 says that the next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the
He
lyre.
did what in his house?
Raved.
Yeah.
So look,
Raved.
raved.
Mine says prophesy.
What translation you have? I'd get rid of that. I can't really answer you, but there was a point at which I thought you were talking about when actually Saul went down to get David, and everybody he had sent was prophesying, and then God had him start prophesying as well.
No, it's what.
But this, you've got raved, right, Glenn?
Yes.
Yeah.
ESV.
And I think the idea here is that Paul was so fit to be tied that he was raving about what was going on. That would be my assessment, but I'd have to study it. I haven't really studied it. Yeah.
Quick commentary on NIV.
Yeah.
It is not a word-for-word
Yeah.
translation. Be careful with it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Terry.
Also says that the Hebrew for that word is sometimes used to indicate uncontrolled ecstatic behavior.
There you go.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay, like a rave. All right, so let me ask you a question. Have any of you ever achieved at a high level, and all of a sudden people begin to resist you or sabotage you? People seem angry and they don't cooperate. Marty?
I mean, that might, and I think, I don't know, it has something to do with the kind of business I was in, but I think for 40 years, there was always somebody out to get me.
And no matter what you do or try to do, you run into roadblocks or issues on the left or issues on the right, and you run into stuff. It's happened to me a lot too. And Gigi calls these things God's sandpaper experiences. What do you think she means by that? Huh? What's that? Smoothing off the edges, refining you. Yeah. Well, so Marty, what do you have to do to kind of deal with that stuff?
Well, I mean, I think the right thing to do is to just do the right thing and try to ignore it. But it's hard not to be hurt by that.
Yeah.
And, you know, it just constantly hate it. But I persevered, but I had to deal with it really my whole career.
Yeah.
Always.
And it's not fun to have to deal with. Yeah, Gigi.
Yeah, I just want to say that's not original with me. I read it somewhere.
See, she said it to me so much, I thought it was original. But you know, when I worked for Dr. Falwell, I was at breakfast with him one day, and he had an assistant who was with him. And the assistant was arrogant and cocky. And he said all kinds of things to me. I was a know nothing, do nothing kind of guy. And it really annoyed the daylights out of me. As a matter of fact, I got up from the table and walked towards him, and another guy just kind of grabbed me and said, sit down. And and I saw him, we had a basketball game, and so I was showing off, and I played a pretty good game, and he came by me outside and said, well, pretty good basketball player, lousy development officer. You know, what do you do with that? So someone advised me to begin praying for him. I'm thinking, really? I began praying for him, and he was gone within 6 weeks. He was gone. Watch out, watch out.
That only happens to successful people. That's a sign you were successful. I mean, like Marty's case, that was certainly.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's a combination of success and the other person's a moron, but that's beside the point. Go ahead, Alvin.
When I was working with Sperry as a senior systems analyst, I had a year where my review was, according to my immediate boss, I was doing so poorly that he wasn't going to give me any increase at all. Well, when his recommendation went up the line, the head of our division gave me a 5% increase. That even made him madder. And it was but a year later that I went into the ministry, and as I was leaving, the day I was leaving, he said, I want to talk to you. So we went down a back step, and he said, well, you got your wish. I said, what wish? He says, I've been dismissed. I had never campaigned against him at all, but he was convinced that I was the reason why he had been dismissed. He was being dismissed because that's the way he was with everybody. He thought everybody was out for him.
It happens, and it happens fairly regularly. But the idea is that it's not necessarily about the circumstances. A pastor named David Dykes said something. Can you read this, Jack?
We are all like a rough piece of wood. None of us are perfect. And the master carpenter wants to improve us, to prepare us for his perfect finish to be applied to our lives. In Philippians 1:6, it says, for I am sure of this, that he who started a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. Sometimes God has to use some heavenly sandpaper to smooth out our rough edges. It's not a pleasant experience, but he's just preparing us for his wonderful finish to be applied to our lives.
Isn't that great? Isn't that great? I mean, that's essentially what God is doing. So it's not really necessarily about the circumstances. It's more like a test for us. I remember when we had John Wooden here for the Bellman Medal, and I was his personal escort. Of course, I volunteered for that, but I was his personal escort for 3 days. And so I had a lot of one-on-one time with Coach Wooden. And he told me one time, he said, you know, the game is a test. It's not a test for my players, it's a test for me. And the test is, how well have I done? Did I prepare my players well enough? Did I act according to who I am and whose I am during the course of the game? And I thought that was just John Wooden, if you saw him, carried a program in one hand and his other hand was in his pocket. You know what was in his pocket? A cross. And he rubbed that cross and he told me I wanted to remember who I was and whose I was. Isn't that great? And essentially, this is really how we handle this is a test for us. And really, God kept saying these characters along the way to me. And Gigi would say, well, did you ever think that he might be telling you something? But essentially, it was a test. And I'm getting better at that test. How many can relate to that? How many can relate to that? I mean, if you're in the nitty gritty trying to do anything, you're going to meet with resistance. And sometimes that sandpaper comes in the form of circumstances, but sometimes that sandpaper comes in the form of people. And really for David, there were many. Think about it. There was Goliath, there was Saul, there was Nabal, there was his son Absalom, there were several others. And his experiences with these people refined his manner, and it also strengthened him. Now, Mary Sutherland, who is a Christian author, anybody ever read anything by her? Mary Sutherland actually wrote a book entitled Sandpaper People. Okay, isn't that great? Sandpaper, but here's what she said. Do you read that?
Sandpaper people are not only a reality of life, but opportunities from the heart of God. God uses difficult relationships in my life as catalysts through which he lovingly upsets my comfortable plans and purposefully redirects my safe and sound steps. Every relationship, difficult or easy, is wrapped in God's love, faithfully delivered with his permission and wrapped in his plan.
He lovingly upsets my comfortable plans and purposefully redirects my safe and sound step. Isn't that great? And God, that's God alive and working in you. Yeah.
Don't you think, all that we're talking about here, we want to be in God's will. We know that God has good things for us. And then we look at Saul, and it's like Judges. He thought everything was right in his own eyes. He thought he could do it all.
Sure, that's right.
And so it's such a contrast. And we want to be like David.
Well, David was victorious. David was successful, but there were reasons. And what I would ask you is, what's the solution to those sandpaper experiences when they're with people? What's the solution here? Well, I've got the solution, and it's listed in 1 John 4:11. Can you read that, Jack?
Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another.
So essentially, number one, it's important, it's essential for us to love those people. And sometimes it's people who slap us in the face, either physically or figuratively. Yeah, Marty.
Yeah, I was gonna say, in the last year or so before I retired, there was this one guy that was just after me all the time. And it'd been so painful. And I just decided I'm just gonna make myself love him.
Yeah.
So I did, and I complimented him, and I complimented him in front of people about what a great job he was doing. And, he was trying to get me every chance he got. And I just kept doing that. And I just kept keeping it up. And it made me feel better.
Yeah.
It made me feel better. And then after I left, a few months after I retired, one of the other managers kind of started emailing me and calling me, and he wanted to talk. So we had lunch, and this guy was doing the same thing to him.
Oh, was he really?
And he said, what should I do? And I said, well, I'll tell you what I did. I just loved it. And, his thing, he said, I can't do that.
It's tough. It's not easy. Yeah.
One of the most insightful things was what Jesus said to Pilate, when Pilate said, do you not have authority over you? He said, you would have no authority over me.
Yeah, I love that.
And that's true when we run into these situations. But I'm a slow learner, and I almost never.
I think we all are. And that's what Mary said. If you take a look at that quote, the lower picture, the purpose of every storm is to purify and cultivate endurance. And isn't that the truth? What's interesting about this, okay, so I'm supposed to love. How am I supposed to love? Well, 1 Corinthians 13:4 says that. Jack?
Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs.
So love is patient. What's that mean? Well, when situations that seem demanding or chaotic occur, you have to be patient in that. Certainly David was patient, was he not? I mean, David had at least 2 opportunities to kill Saul and he didn't do it. Why? Because he was God's anointed. David knew that, and David wanted God to take care of that. So David had to be patient, even though he was pursued, even though several times he was close to being caught, David was patient. Love is kind. When people are mean, when people are rude, when people are unyielding, as Marty said, it's important for us to be kind. It doesn't justify our lack of kindness. Love does not envy. When people seem to have more than I have, when people seem to receive more than I have, it's not my responsibility to be envious of them. Love does not boast. When I or one of my family members achieve something, it's not good to boast about it. It's okay to talk about it, but to boast about it and constantly bring it up, that's another story. And I can remember some of the folks in here whose kids, I remember when Ben was rising with his music and he played at the stadium in front of just tons of people with Michael W. Smith. That was pretty cool. That was pretty heavy. But Ben, has anybody heard Ben sing? Ben's a great singer. I love that. I loved it. But I didn't hear Marty and Ken bringing it up all the time. And that's the idea. It's a matter of certainly you're proud and you're pleased, but it's not boasting. Love is not conceited. What does that mean? Well, when I use a gift that God has given me and I receive some adulation, it's not my responsibility, nor is it good for me to invite more. And I think essentially 1 Corinthians 13, 1 John tells us to love. 1 Corinthians tells us how to love. And it's important that we not only love, but that we know loud enough, that we're patient, that we're kind, we don't envy, we don't boast, we're not conceited. Yeah, Alvin.
One of the things I love about the Bible is that in the Psalms, David lets us know the turmoil he was going through, even though in the actual biography, we don't see that at all. We see his successes, but in his Psalms, we see his turmoil.
Yeah. And some of the turmoil we read in Psalms is as a result of David's sin as well. Glenn.
What you see in this list up here is that love is not self-focused. It's
That's right.
outward focused.
Right.
That's exactly right, Glenn. Well, next, Saul sets a trap for David. But David escapes that trap. 1 Samuel 18, 17 through 19.
Saul said to David, "Here's my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." For Saul said to himself, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that."
Okay, so Saul clearly shows his hand here. Saul offers his older daughter to David to keep his promise to the victor over Goliath. And on the surface, the offer of marriage seems benevolent on the part of Saul. But what's interesting about this is that even though Saul had thrown 2 spears at David, right here his motive is revealed because, as I said earlier, Saul wanted the Philistines to kill him in battle. And he wanted to put him out there. And Saul offers Merab to be married. David declines because remember, David came from humble means. Okay. In those days, grooms had to pay a dowry. And can you imagine the dowry, the healthy dowry that David would have had to pay for Merab? The more prestigious the bride, the greater the dowry. And David had very little means. So Saul gives Miriam to someone else. And I think this was an attempt to make David either jealous or angry or both. Well, why? Well, if David did retaliate, he'd be arrested and charged with treason. But David didn't bite on this trap, didn't bite on it. He let her go. And really, he couldn't have afforded the dowry anyway. And so Michal steps up, his other daughter, and she expresses her love for him. And Saul tells David he doesn't want a dowry. Okay? Doesn't want a dowry at all. Instead, he wants 100 foreskins of Philistines. Now, for the life of me, what is going on here? Do you ever think about what is wrong with you guys? But anyway, what Saul's really saying here is that I'm not asking much. I just want you to put your life on the line and go kill 100 Philistines. Okay, that's what he's saying. But to Saul's amazement, what does he do? David does go out, survive, conquer, and fulfill Saul's request. So David's fame rises, and Saul fears a coup, and he therefore plans to kill David. 1 Samuel 18:28-30, Jack.
When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days.
So realize what this says here. Saul remains David's enemy for the rest of his days. Okay.
The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known.
So think about this. Saul keeps throwing David out there in intense battles, hoping that he's going to be killed. That sound familiar? Did anybody else put anybody out in an intense battle, hoping he'd be killed? Who was that? David. David did it with Uriah. So God gives David more and more success. And Saul keeps sending him into battle. And I believe he was hoping that he'd be killed, but he kept winning battles and his fame grew. So in his frustration, and you can imagine that Saul was frustrated by this, Saul finally does something. 1 Samuel 19:1-3, Jack.
Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan was very fond of David and warned him, "My father, Saul, is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and will tell you what I find out."
So Saul puts his servants and his son in a very tough position, doesn't he? I mean, they love David, and yet they're ordered to go kill him. And so Jonathan pleads to his father on David's behalf. 1 Samuel 19:4-7, Jack.
Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason?"
So Jonathan challenges his father with a rational argument, and everything seems to settle down, at least for a while. But there's an interesting principle here. And God tells us we're to respect authority, does he not? Okay, now Jonathan's father is both a parent, but he's also king. And yet, Jonathan disobeys him. And actually, we're commanded to submit to authority. So is Jonathan sinning here? Is Jonathan sinning here? Well, he's appealing, but eventually he comes against his father. Is he sinning when he does that?
God's authority, man's authority.
See, Jonathan could never respond to an order to kill anyone, could he? The order was immoral. And we're commanded to submit to authority unless that authority orders us to sin. Acts 5:28-29, Jack.
We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name, he said. Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood. Peter and the other apostles replied, we must obey God rather than men.
So the apostles stood up to the authority at the time, and they were righteously doing that. David Guzik weighed in on this. Jack, can you read that from David Guzik?
We are under authority and commanded to submit to God's order of authority in many different arenas. There's a biblical submission from children to parents, from citizens to government, from employees to employers, from Christians to church leadership, and from wives to husbands. But in all these relationships, we are never excused from sin because we obeyed an authority that told us to sin. In this case, it would be wrong for Jonathan to obey his father and kill David.
Isn't that great? I like David Guzik because he explains things simply, but he's absolutely correct. It's important to obey authority unless the authority challenges you to do something that's sinful. You know, you've got a pastor in Canada, a Polish pastor in Canada, who is in prison. Why?
Preaching the gospel.
Keeping his church open and preaching the gospel. So the government told him to shut his church down. And that's what he did. He challenged them, saying, you have no authority to do that. I work for and represent a larger authority. Okay. And essentially he paid the price. Well, I'll tell you, Christians may have to pay more prices in the future because the government, if allowed to, will become more authoritarian, not less authoritarian.
He did awesome.
Yeah, John MacArthur stood up to him, didn't he?
Oh, he did, and they had to pay fines, but you know, they even took their parking lot away from them, and the synagogue down the street opened up to them, and they're still parking in the synagogue space. So, you know, the government, though, as a civil government, has no rights over God's people, God's church. In that regard, I mean, telling them not to worship.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question about it, but at some point, we're going to have to face those same things. Well, meanwhile, David wins another battle and Saul gets upset once more. 1 Samuel 19, 8-12.
Once more war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. But an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. While David was playing the harp, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall.
So David now knows that this is serious. I mean, this is serious stuff. And so what does he do? He goes to Samuel, who takes him somewhere. Go ahead, Jack.
That night, David made good on his escape. Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. Then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head.
Now he went to Naoth in Ramah, and that's a community of prophets that's located about 6 miles north of Jerusalem. And Michal covers for David, and the image that she used was called a teraphim, and it's a household idol. It was a good luck charm, and it was used for fertility. It was not really thought to be an idol, but it was an idol, very much so, but more of an aid in worshiping the true God. It's kind of funny, isn't it? It sounds like syncretism, where we pull a lot of different practices into the church. Yet it was an idol and probably was Michal's idol and not David's, which talks a little bit then, or shows you a little bit about her upbringing. So now back to Saul and his pursuit of David. And you've got word of his location getting back to Saul. So he sends assassins, and they were to capture and kill David. And instead, each of them begins prophesying. So Saul went to do it himself, but he too started prophesying. 1 Samuel 19, 23 and 24.
So Saul went to Naioth at Ramah, but the Spirit of God came upon him, and he walked along prophesying until he came to Naioth. He stripped off his robes and also prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay that way all that day and night. This is why people say, is Saul also among the prophets?
So Saul goes there, he's gonna take care of David himself, and he starts prophesying. In other words, the Holy Spirit would not allow him to continue to pursue David. So finally, let's look briefly at Jonathan's bravery that saves David as he acts on and reaffirms their covenant. Now David knew that Saul put a hit on him. That's my language, put a hit out on him. And naturally, he wondered why. 1 Samuel 20, verses 1 and 2, Jack.
Then David fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan and asked, "What have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he is trying to take my life?" "Never," Jonathan replied. "You are not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything great or small without confiding in me. Why would he hide this from me? It's not so."
All right, so Jonathan tries to comfort David. And really, there's really a brief step between, as David says, me and death. And David's expressing a little bit of fear here, and he knew Saul was trying to kill him. And he didn't know why that was happening. But he also knew that he was likely to be killed, and he was displaying a little bit of discouragement here. And really, Jonathan is trying to encourage, not discourage him. So Jonathan reassures him, telling him he'll do anything David wanted him to do. And remember, think about this. Why is this an act on the part of Jonathan? Why is this act unusual? Why is that unusual? Well, remember who Jonathan is. Who's Jonathan? He's the crown prince. What does that mean? He's the crown prince. He's the heir apparent. What again does this tell you about Jonathan? He's humble, he's a servant. So David tells him that he'll hide in the field, and if your father misses me, meaning at the meals, tell him the following. 1 Samuel 26 and 7.
"If your father misses me at all, tell him David earnestly asked my permission to hurry to Bethlehem, his hometown, because an annual sacrifice is being made there for his whole clan. If he says, 'Very well,' then your servant is safe. But if he loses his temper, you can be sure that he is determined to harm me."
So essentially, David tells Jonathan, listen, if I'm guilty, kill me. And he wants him to go test the waters, but Jonathan responds to him in 1 Samuel 20, verses 8 and 9.
"As for you, show kindness to your servant, for you have brought him into a covenant with you before the Lord. If I am guilty, then kill me yourself. Why hand me over to your father?" "Never," Jonathan said. "If I had the least inkling that my father was determined to harm you, wouldn't I tell you?"
So now next, Jonathan asks David something that would be really expected of covenant partners in 1 Samuel 20, 13 through 17, Jack.
"But if my father is inclined to harm you, may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I do not let you know and send you away safely. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. But show me unfailing kindness like that of the Lord as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth."
So first he promises to warn David. Second, he asks him to show his unfailing love and kindness to him and to his family. And he asks him never to cut that off. And finally, Jonathan had David reaffirm his love. Now, Jonathan and David agreed to care for each other, and Jonathan would protect David, and he'd warn him really and reject Saul's command to kill him. Now that's big. And while David agreed to protect and care for Jonathan and his family, it's actually a commitment that he fulfilled in 2 Samuel 21:7. Can you read that, Jack?
The king spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the oath before the Lord between David and Jonathan, son of Saul.
Now in verses 18 through 22, Jonathan gives David specific details of his plan. And then he reminds him of something else he should consider in 1 Samuel 20:23.
And about the matter you and I discussed, remember, the Lord is witness between you and me forever.
What is Jonathan doing here? He knows that David will soon be king, and a common practice of kings would be to destroy the heirs of the previous kingship. And David will prove his integrity by keeping his commitment to Jonathan. Now, there are lots of things that transpire here. And one of the things that Will Rogers says is that it takes a lifetime to build a reputation, but you can lose it in a minute. And later on, 2 Samuel, we'll see that in laziness and lust, David does damage his reputation as we get there. But David misses a couple of meals and things progress. And the remainder of the chapter is about Jonathan warning David as he promised. And what's interesting here is that Jonathan and David say goodbye and they express love towards one another. Jack, can you read this in 1 Samuel 20 verses 41 and 42?
After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.' Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town."
Now, at some points, it says they also embraced and kissed each other. Okay? All right, it says that. Now, they express love towards each other. It's likely the last time they're going to see each other. Does this mean, as some use this verse, does this mean they had a gay relationship? Well, have you ever heard that? I mean, that's been used by certain pastors, certain churches to say that they had a same-sex relationship, which seems ridiculous. But here's what one pastor said. He's a pastor of systemic theology, Kevin DeYoung. Jack, can you read that?
It makes much more sense to say the only reason David and Jonathan can be presented with this intense male friendship is because it was understood that a same-sex intimacy would have been severely frowned upon. I think of one anecdote. At some point in Abraham Lincoln's travels, he'd sleep in the same bed with an assistant or a male secretary, which was not at all strange. It's only because of culture and the things that we are wrestling with that male friendship or camaraderie seems unusual. Jonathan is actually the means of David's ascendancy to the throne through friendship.
Isn't that a great description? You know, I love that. And I didn't even think that until I started reading a lot about preachers online who were saying that this is a result of a same-sex relationship, which is ridiculous, but it tells you you've got to know the truth and you've got to be willing to stand up for the truth and you've got to be willing to state the truth. God loves us and he commands us to love each other. Jonathan and David's relationship is a perfect example of what God told us to do. Love each other. In the high priestly prayer, Jesus prayed that we would be one as he and the Father is one. Okay? David and Jonathan were one. All that Jonathan had and all that he was became and was exchanged for all that David had and all that David was and would become. And essentially, we're the beneficiaries of that. Let's pray. Alvin?